Why does Boston have such confusing streets? Why is it so hard to drive in Boston? Well, a lot of it has to do with the confusing street network. There's no grid in central Boston, but instead a labyrinth of narrow streets meeting at odd angles. The myth is that they simply paved over old cow paths. That's not strictly true, though cows were absolutely regular users of Boston city streets until the 1820s. We have to go back even farther to understand the reason for Boston's network. Let's start at 1630, the year Boston was officially founded. At that time, there was a Puritan settlement in Charlestown across the Charles River, but the colonists found it difficult to find fresh water. One important geography note here, Boston has added a lot of land to its shoreline over the years, and in 1830 the Shawmut Peninsula, where central Boston is located, looked more like this. Anyway, across the river on the Shawmut Peninsula lived one European settler all by himself, William Blackston. He had a hut and an orchard, but most importantly, he had a really good spring all to himself. He wrote a letter to the Puritans across the river, inviting them to settle near him instead, and they accepted. Blackston lived on the west side of the peninsula, but the Puritans set up shop on the east side, as it had the best natural harbors and was close to the spring. Here's what the street network looked like around that time. Already you can see it was kind of, well, a mess. No neat and orderly grid here, the kind that modern drivers would appreciate. But the Puritans had their reasons. You wouldn't know it from walking around Boston today, but the Boston of 1630 was a mix of hills and tidal marshes with precious little flat, dry land. Here, let me show you the hills and marshes. You can see how most of the streets are careful to avoid these obstacles. Braxton himself kept 50 acres of land right here south of Beacon Hill, so that was off limits to roads and development as well. Braxton actually left for uninhabited Rhode Island 5 years later. Apparently he was the kind of guy who really needed his space. Governor Winthrop bought Braxton's plot when he left and it became Boston Common. For the next 100 years, it would be both a pleasure ground and a working pasture. Many of the households in Boston had a cow, and people would walk them through the streets to Boston Common to let them pasture there. It wasn't uncommon for 100 cows to be munching away while picnickers hung out nearby. What emerged was a street network that connected important harbor locations while avoiding natural obstacles. But did it really preclude the Puritans from setting up a grid? I mean, other colonial cities like New Haven and Philadelphia were built with a grid right away. Why not Boston? Well, what if we take a typical block from the Philadelphia grid plan and overlay it across Boston? The result is really not much better than what you have now. You have maybe two major streets going north and south through the most important part of the city, and getting anywhere else requires zigzagging. Maybe there's a grid dimension and orientation better suited for Boston, but it would be hard to figure out when every area seems to be diagonal from everything else. Grids make more sense when you have a large expanse of land. It makes it easier to add on to the city. Just add another standard block to the outside edge. Grids facilitate the efficient sale of land and can make it easier to grow rapidly. Boston in the 1630s was worried more about survival than rapid growth. Boston's weather oscillates between bitter cold in the winter to sticky hot in the summer. Between the hills and the swamps, farmers found rocky glacial soil that was difficult to till. There was no cash crop in the area like tobacco and cotton in the south, just the sea and trade. Basically, nothing in the early fundamentals of Boston suggested it needed a grid in anticipation of rapid growth. It only had 10,000 people 100 years after its founding. And when Boston did need to expand, it didn't do so in an orderly way. This is different than what happened down south in Manhattan. New York grew in an organic, Boston-esque way in the 17th and 18th centuries, but then planned for the orderly development of the rest of Manhattan in 1811. Back in Boston, there was no large swath of land to expand into. Here's a look at the original 1630 land area compared to today's. It's totally different. Boston is barely connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land. Boston had to expand into the sea, and one of the first landfill projects was the Mill Pond. By the 1830s, there were no mills that needed it, and it was stagnant and gross. Bostoners were busy lopping off the top of Beacon Hill and Copp's Hill to expand the city and needed a place for the dirt and gravel to go. They solved two problems at once and got a lot more usable land area. Modern-day Causeway Street is named after the dam that created Mill Pond in about the same location it was back then. The filled-in area is a nice little grid, but it doesn't really line up with anything else. The street networks in the newly lowered Beacon Hill and Copp's Hill areas weren't particularly grid-like. The closest thing Boston has to an orderly Manhattan-style grid is the Back Bay neighborhood. It's a story similar to the Mill Pond infill project. There was a mill dam that separated the Charles River from the pond, which used to be tidal flats. Here's what that looked like back in 1858. By that date, The city was already a year into filling in the mill pond to make a new residential neighborhood for Boston's elite, filled with Victorian mansions in orderly rows. Today's Beacon Street was the old Mill Pond Dam. And the neighborhood is now home to other 19th century treasures like Trinity Church, the Museum of Fine Arts, and the Boston Public Library. Some of the straight streets in the Back Bay were carried through to tie to other parts of the city. Beacon Street continues southwest, and a few others go southeast. But in general, outside of Back Bay, Boston devolves into a clash of grids without any single organizing force. Now, this is a complete tangent, but New Orleans is the poster child for clashing grids. The city expanded along the Mississippi, and every expansion oriented the grid to the river's edge. Those grids continue to fan out from there, and you end up with lots of weird intersections along the seams. Market Street in San Francisco might be the most famous grid seams street in the US, and they ended up shutting it down to car traffic, in part due to the weird intersections along the length of it. Okay, back to Boston. I think we've established that the history of Boston's growth made it difficult to have an orderly, easy to understand grid pattern. This results in intersections that make it difficult to drive. Let's look at the intersection right here at the corner of Back Bay, where it meets the rest of the city. You have a nice orthogonal intersection cut through by Columbus Avenue, creating a challenging six-leg intersection. It's definitely not an ideal intersection to drive through, if only for all the time spent waiting for the other legs to go first. These kind of intersections can not only be confusing, but they can be dangerous for all road users. For example, one study found that non-orthogonal intersections posed a significantly higher crash risk to bicyclists, due in part to visibility issues with tight angles. Combine that with the wide roads and higher speeds that you find in the previous intersection, and you get a recipe for crashes. Drivers intuitively understand when a place like this feels less safe, and they get stressed out, making them not want to drive there. Thus begins Boston's reputation for being confusing to drive and a generally hard place to drive. What can a place like Boston do to make their city more legible, particularly to visitors who may be unfamiliar with the crazy network of streets? Wayfinding and signage are big ones. I've heard from native Bostonians that their city can be difficult to navigate in the past because street signs were obscured or missing. Nothing was labeled, basically. I found Boston to be reasonably well signed when I visited, but I didn't drive, so I had more of an opportunity to search for obscured signs or just use my phone to navigate. Wayfinding and signage deserves its own video, but signs can definitely make a complicated street network more legible to users. City planners also need to make sure they don't add too many signs, which results in clutter that makes it hard for road users to understand what to pay attention to. When signs aren't enough, it might be better to simplify the intersections themselves. It's become quite popular recently to eliminate right turn slip lanes or add traffic diverters to close off some turning options at intersections to make the traffic run smoother and eliminate confusion. Now, sometimes diverters can make things more complicated as they create dead ends, but they make intersections safer for all users. And by reducing choice, they can make it easier to navigate a complex city street system. Finally, if a city is very difficult for drivers to navigate, maybe it's best to reduce driving as much as possible. Places like Boston are fairly dense with a decent mass transit system by US standards. I found the T system to be very easy to navigate and understand, in contrast to the street network for drivers. Cities like Boston can lean into that simplicity instead of bending over backward to make it easier for drivers. Boston was founded almost 400 years ago, well before the car was around. Contrary to popular lore, they didn't pave cow paths, but they certainly didn't foresee 20th century transportation options either. Transportation is about to get even more complicated as the US begins to transition away from gas-powered cars to technologies like electric vehicles. These fights can get politically charged, and you might not have noticed that the US House of Representatives passed a bill prohibiting bans on gas-powered cars. This is an effort by the conservative-led House to counter the Biden administration's push to electrify the nation's vehicle fleet. You may not have heard about this story because it was really only reported in conservative news sources. I know that's the case because I'm using Ground News, a website that aggregates news articles and can tell you the political lean of various sources. There's this handy graphic over here that shows that 69% of the sources on this story lean right. Then you can even choose your preferred news source based on political lean. If you don't have time for that, Ground News presents summaries that also have their own political lean. That's pretty cool. Ground News was designed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven way to read the news. I certainly find it helpful when researching video topics. I can better understand what's true and what's not, and what's spin and what's not. My favorite feature might be the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. It can help you find stories that you might have missed had you stayed in your curated social media bubble. Ground News is a fantastic tool for sifting through all the daily misinformation and bias. They provide you with all the information you need to be a better critical thinker, and I can't recommend them enough. In fact, I believe Ground News is so useful that I'm offering 30% off their Vantage subscription. You can only access this discount through my link. So go to ground.news/citybeautiful or click on the link on screen or in the description to support an independent media platform working to make the media more transparent.